opioids are the drug of deindustrialized neoliberal capitalism. Can you talk a little bit about caffeine in the 18th century? Because I loved this chapter.
So caffeine is a fascinating case. I wanted to put it in because it's a legal drug, and just like because we really get hung up on this, like, you know, legal drugs are good, illegal drugs are bad, and this moralization of drugs. But we're all using them of one kind or another. 90% of people on the planet use caffeine on a daily basis, whether it's coffee, tea, or soda. Most sodas are caffeinated. It's the only psychoactive we give our children.
I mean, you know, if you're Muslim, you can't drink alcohol, but the role of tea and coffee in Islamic countries is huge.
Yeah, and that's why. I mean, and indeed, they are. Caffeine and alcohol are in this seesaw relationship in a very interesting way. What's also interesting about caffeine is we can mark when it arrives in Europe. I mean, it starts in Eastern Africa and Ethiopia, and the Arabian Peninsula has it earlier, but it shows up in London in the 1640s, both coffee, tea, and chocolate. Great decade. And
imagine if before that all you'd had was cabbage, not even a potato at that point, and then suddenly along comes coffee, tea, and chocolate, and you were like, Jesus Christ.
You had alcohol, and
and indeed,
people were drinking enormous amounts of alcohol before caffeine came in. The reason being, besides the fact people like it, is it's safer to drink than water. And so even children were given, you know, dilute alcohol, given cider, hard cider as we call it, because it was safer than the water, because both the alcohol in alcohol and the fermentation process destroys bacteria, microbes. So you know, everybody's tipsy in England. You cannot operate heavy machinery in the state people were in. You cannot do double entry bookkeeping. You cannot have an industrial revolution in the state people were in. And so caffeine comes in, and people start writing. I quote these accounts of, you know, a new, more sober Englishman has arisen. And, you know, obviously alcohol didn't go away. It's still very present.
Yeah, just go to any football away day. It's alive and well.
During the workday, it became caffeine. And caffeine takes off. You have this wonderful coffee culture that springs up. Coffee was big here before tea. Tea comes late. Tea was actually expensive and came later. Only after the whole imperialist, you know, relationship with China was established. But coffee came first. There were hundreds of coffee houses that sprang up in the course of a couple of years. It was like, I don't know, you know, Starbucks, something to Leon's or whatever, you know, whatever's on every corner in England. And they were wonderful places. They were more democratic than pubs, which had a class structure. Of course, there was, you know, you couldn't sit anywhere. It depended on your class. But anyone could sit anywhere. And when I say anyone, I mean any man could sit anywhere in a coffee house. And each coffee house became like a special interest magazine. So if you were interested in literature, there was one you go to in Covent Garden. I forget the name of it. And there would be Dryden and Pope and, you know, all the writers.
All the scriblarians.
Yeah, the scriblarians, right. And if you were interested in, if you were in trade, there was Lloyd's, which became Lloyd's of London. You could actually go there and find somebody to take out a policy on your shipment. If you were interested in science, there was one very closely connected with the Royal Society, and scientists would hang out there. And I forget who it was, but Newton or somebody like dissected a dolphin, and, you know, once to show everybody, you know, that it was a mammal. And
at a coffee shop.
At a coffee shop, yes. Must have been pretty nasty.
Just imagine that with your flat white, and you're like, there's a
yes, a splayed dolphin. So whatever your interest, you could find your coffee shop. And then people would also go from one to another bringing news. It was really like the internet of its time. And coffee became a big fad. People were drinking coffee. They tended to do it not at home, but in public. It wasn't like a pub where people would just get, you know, shit-faced. Here, the conversation was intense. And it was very political, too. People talked politics.
And was it less violent? Because when I think about the early modern tavern, I think about Christopher Marlowe, like, getting stabbed in the eye and that kind of thing. Was it just a less volatile environment?
It was definitely a more civil environment. I mean, alcohol, you know, breeds that kind of behavior in a way that caffeine doesn't. And so it was alarming to some, because the conversation would turn to what's wrong with the crown and the government And in fact, the French Revolution, the crowd that stormed the Bastille was whipped up in a coffee house, not a tavern. And so caffeine had a huge effect on European history. And what's great about it is it's the only drug where we see the before and the after. So you can really tell a story of what's the impact of that chemical arriving in Europe. And I think it was profound. I think it contributes to the Age of Reason. I think it contributes to the Enlightenment in France. All the great Enlightenment thinkers were serious coffee hounds. I mean, I think it was Diderot who had like 72 cups a day.
72?
Yes. Balzac. But he got a encyclopedia written. Balzac could not write without, he was up all night on coffee. He was convinced that his imagination depended on coffee. He got to the point, as his tolerance developed, where he came up with a new way of ingesting coffee, which is forget the water. He would basically ingest, he thought this was the purest form.
Racking up lines of coffee grounds.
Exactly. He didn't snort it, he swallowed it. And can you imagine the state of his stomach? But he was convinced that was the way to deliver the biggest jolt of caffeine to his brain. And I do think that this drug was instrumental in the rise of capitalism. And the reason I think that's true is because it made us better workers. You could work longer, you could work harder, you could work with more refinement and focus. You could handle heavy machinery. And you could have a night shift and an overnight shift. Even if you had gas light, getting people to stay up that long was really hard. And suddenly you had a drug that would help people stay up through the night. And so you could run your big machines 24 hours. So that was huge. I mean, so in terms of extracting value from the English worker, caffeine was a fantastic tool. In the Industrial Revolution, in the factories, it wasn't coffee, it was tea. And it was tea with huge amounts of sugar.
There's the famous Stuart Hall quote where he says, "I am the sugar at the bottom of the English cup of tea. Other people are the tea themselves." What do we know about the English? They can't get through the day without their cup of tea. But
I love that
external history of the colonies is right here.
Yes.
Our notion of Englishness.
The whole imperialism. You needed the sugar because the tea was pretty bad tea. It was very bitter, and at least initially. And the sugar also kept people going. It's itself a stimulant, but it also was a very important source of calories in the English working class diet. I forget what the percentage is, but it was a very high percentage of calories. It was just pure sugar with no nutrition and obviously all sorts of other problems that it gave people. And so the proof, I think, the best proof that caffeine offered more to capital than to labor is the fact that the coffee break became an institution in America.
Yeah, can you tell us about the invention of the coffee break? Because I can't imagine a working day without it, but it's a relatively new invention.
It is. It was not codified till the 1950s, but there's a story I tell in the book. It's a wonderful history of a company in Colorado that made men's neckties. And during the war, during World War II, the young men who were operating the looms, and it was very complicated work, very hard work, many, many colors, complicated patterns. They got drafted and they went off to war. And so they brought in these older men to do it. And the quality control went down, and they couldn't do an 8-hour shift. And then they tried women. They brought in women to do it. And the women could do a beautiful job, but they couldn't do more than like 4 or 5 hours. And then the quality control would go down. So he convenes a meeting. It's called Wigwam Weavers is the company. He convenes a meeting and he says, what could we do? We need 8-hour shifts. And they said, well, if you gave us 2 breaks and gave us coffee at like 10 in the morning and 4 in the afternoon, we could do it. And so he does an experiment. And suddenly their work is just as good as the men who are off at war. And productivity goes way up. So he institutionalizes. In fact, he makes it mandatory, a coffee break, time off, and the free drug. He provides
and do they get paid
coffee,
during their coffee break?
And they're getting paid during these 20 minutes. He later tried to take back that 20 minutes, but that didn't work. And so this is the first time. There were other cases where we know of corporations that gave coffee and tea to their workers, and we know others that gave break time. but the combination of the drug and the time in which to enjoy it begins at this company, and it takes off. And American businesses realize that this is a very good investment to give them the 20 minutes off and give them coffee and tea, and you will get a better day's work out of them. And thus was born the coffee break.